I'm delighted to have secured this debate today, as it gives us an opportunity to highlight the situation that we're facing in England, where children with special educational needs and disabilities are being left behind due to the inherent regional inequality in the high needs national funding formula. Of course, there is a bigger issue, and the more typical thing we talk about in this House is about the overall quantum of spending based on the overall need. But too little attention is given to the distribution of funding that exists, whether it's in healthcare, education, policing or otherwise. But I know I'm not the only member of this House being turned to by their constituents who are at their wits' end trying to navigate what feels to be a broken system. And I thank colleagues across the House for their continued advocacy on behalf of some of the most vulnerable children in all our communities. My argument is a simple, yet I think deeply important one, that the current model of SEND funding in this country is not only inconsistent, but in too many cases profoundly unfair. It fails to account for genuine levels of need, the realities faced by families and the systemic pressures schools and local authorities are under. Unless this changes, we'll continue to fail children who rely on members in this House to make their case and to get this right. I'm happily give way to the honourable gentleman.
He makes a really profoundly important point. There is a real and urgent need to reform the SEND system in this country, and that includes how it's funded, of course. So will he welcome the £750 million ring-fenced in yesterday's spring statement exactly for that, to transform our SEND system, make it fairer for parents, make it better for young people, and make it more sustainable for the future as well?
Gentleman for his question. He's going to take me to a point further on in my speech, but he's absolutely right. He makes the case exactly as I intend to the Minister, to say, given that we have a broken distribution system and given the severity of its impact on so many children and families, will she ensure that that money, which is in the spending review, as he rightly says, is used precisely for that purpose, and we target those who are being most left behind. That's why, at the heart of this debate, I'm calling on the Government to identify and commit to a clear baseline cost for delivering effective SEND support per pupil. The figure must reflect what it genuinely takes, both in urban and rural settings, to support children with complex needs across the country. Only then can we ensure that no child's opportunity is limited by where they live. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to bring to the attention of the House a stark example that illustrates the postcode lottery in SEND funding. The disparity between East Riding of Yorkshire, which covers my own constituency of Beverley and Holderness, at the lowest end of the funding spectrum, we are the lowest funded in the country, and the London Borough of Camden, which happens to be the highest. Camden, by any standard, is a well-resourced inner-city borough with strong proximity to specialist services. It currently receives £3,564.95 of SEND funding for each pupil in its area. Meanwhile, in the East Riding, a rural area with fewer nearby services, longer travel distances and greater challenges in recruitment and retention, per pupil high needs funding comes in at around £968. That's a gap of £2,500 for every single child requiring extra support. In real terms, if East Riding's funding was matched with instead of Camden's, Madam Deputy Speaker, the second most poorly funded local authority in the country, we would have an extra £18 million per year on top of the £43 million we receive in the higher needs block. £18 million extra. If we were brought into line with Camden, we would have an extra £100 million. Now, while some might argue that urban areas face different pressures, and of course they do, let's be clear, the cost of delivering quality SEND provision in rural areas isn't lower. In fact, it's often significantly higher. Transport costs, and colleagues across the House will be aware of children who have to be moved great distances to access their support. Transport costs for children with complex needs can be astronomical. Recruiting specialist staff like SENCOs to work in isolated schools is a constant challenge. When services like educational psychologists or speech and language therapists are not based locally, schools and families face unacceptable delays in accessing the assessments needed to unlock further support. Why then, Madam Deputy Speaker, is rurality not factored into the high needs funding formula? What this means in practice is that two children with identical needs living in different parts of the country will receive vastly different levels of support. One might have their EHCP reviewed on time, access in-school provision and benefit from local therapy services. The other might be left waiting months for assessment, with a school already at breaking point trying to bridge the gap. This disparity will have a long-term detriment to children's outcomes. Madam Deputy Speaker, this isn't a criticism of any local authority. Camden, like all areas, faces its own pressures and challenges. But the system we have allows such disparities to persist without sufficient recourse or flexibility. These widely varying funding allocations create a two-tiered system in what should be a national commitment. Colleagues from across the House will be familiar with constituents whose stories lay bare the human cost of this imbalance, whether it's parents desperately trying to navigate the EHCP system, the lack of suitable school places nearby to cope with the measures required by their EHCP, or schools struggling to cope. And it's certainly not a party political point, Madam Deputy Speaker. Successive governments have sat over funding disparities and struggled with the politics. They have been unprepared to reallocate, perhaps for understandable reasons. The people you take money from tend to be much angrier than the people you give it to are happy. One marches on Westminster, the other grunts and says about time. So it's a truly difficult thing, and I've been in this place for 20 years and have struggled to get ministers to accept on reallocation and reapportionment. So I hope to come up with, rather than asking for that demand, which I've so far failed in 20 years of effort to get anybody to implement, I'm hoping to come up with something more practical if compromised as a result. I give way to my honourable friend.
I was just going to commend you on your length of service in this House.
My honourable friend, the Deputy Chief Whip, and indeed my whip, is very welcome saying that. Thanks very much. I am grateful for that. So we do have this issue of how we fix a broken and clearly unfair system. What tends to happen, newer colleagues, and there are many of them in the House, would think, well, surely people would want to fix it. If the government does do a map of need, there's no perfect system. There will always be dispute, but fundamentally does an assessment of what fair would look like, and then maps against that line where everyone is. You think they might be prepared to do something at those who are most overfunded to help compensate the underfunded. My experience is they don't, and they won't. So I'll come to it on my speech, of trying to look at practical ways of getting change, because what tends to happen is ministers, despite all their talk in debates like this, typically end up with the Treasury at a spending occasion like yesterday, give 3%. If inflation's 2.5%, they give 3% to everybody. That means the cash gap between one authority and another grows, and in a sense, the injustice grows with it. I'm happy to give way to the Honourable.
I'm really grateful to the Honourable Member. In leading today's debate, I'm conscious that York is in the bottom third, but also that the level of children being diagnosed with SEND is rising really sharply. So in order to future-proof the system, does he agree we need to look at a more holistic, therapeutic and nurturing approach to our education system so that all children benefit? I looked at this in Sweden and saw how that brought down the costs, but also greatly benefited the children there.
He is two things: A, quite right, and B, tempting me down a line I don't want to go down. I want to focus on the distribution because it doesn't get the attention, but she's absolutely right. There's criticism from the party opposite of performance by the then Conservative government, but I think funding for SEND actually grew 60% from 2019 to 2024. 60%. So the Honourable Lady is absolutely right. It's not about who's in government. Somehow we need to find ways of capping this demand, which will outstrip any Chancellor, however well-intentioned. So that is an issue. But if I may, I'll take the issue back to the issue I'm focusing on, which is distribution. If you have a system in which that demand is growing at that scale, which no government can meet, then distribution, although ignored, becomes even more important, because if you've got a system which is straining and struggling, then having distribution which is grossly unfair, which no one can defend, no one seeks to defend. They don't say, it's not one party or the other saying, oh, we think we're getting this right. They recognise that it's unjust. If you don't find ways of balancing it, even over time, then that is a major mistake, because it's not obvious at the moment that anyone is able to stop this imbalance between, if you like, supply here and demand which is out here. Colleagues will have local champions back home who do their best to fight against the regional inequalities. And I would like to take this opportunity, Madam Deputy Speaker, to pay tribute to Councillor Victoria Aitken in the East Riding, who's the portfolio holder responsible for SEND, and in her role with the F40 group, which, for any newer members here, the F40 group fights on the issues and focuses on this funding formula disparities. It's technical and it's quite dull, but it's actually vital for the provision of services to our constituents. She has been tireless in campaigning to address these issues within the SEND system. But sadly, the work of Victoria and others like her is not enough. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to share the story of my constituent Ellie and her son Harry, who is 9.5 years old and has ADHD. From the very start of his education, as early as foundation stage, both Ellie and his teachers recognised that Harry needed extra support. But without an EHCP in place, the help he required simply wasn't available, despite the school doing all that they could. Last summer, as Harry was preparing to enter Year 4, Ellie contacted me in desperation. He was still only just beginning to read and spending his break times playing with children much younger than himself. She had fought tirelessly to secure an assessment so that he could access one-to-one support, but the process was gruelling and caseworkers were at capacity. Ellie, Madam Deputy Speaker, had to give up her job to dedicate the countless hours needed to complete the forms, lodge appeals, chase responses and provide support at home. She put her own education on hold, and in her own words, she's had to battle the system every step of the way. Now, just last week, after years of delay, Harry was finally granted an EHCP. But the school still doesn't know when the funding will arrive to put the support, which has now been recognised, actually in place. He'll start Year 5 this September, several years behind his peers. Ellie describes Harry as a kind and lovely boy who has been failed, not by his school, but by a system that delays, deflects and denies the support children like him need. And yet she remains determined to keep fighting, no matter the cost to her or her family, to ensure Harry gets the help he deserves. And I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and congratulate the member on securing the debate. I'll declare my usual interest. My wife is a SENCO in a local authority school in our patch, and my daughter has an EHCP and a complex set of disabilities, so absolutely, I fought this battle myself. But will the member agree with me that what he's just described is a system that is broken, that does need reform, and whatever we see in that white paper in the autumn, hopefully we will see that reform, and particularly reform which relies on more training for all teachers across the profession, because I think some of that is what he's just described.
Well, the honourable gentleman is right. There's a capacity issue, as I say, against demand, and getting people, not just specialists, but the whole system and everyone in it to have a better understanding, as he will see in his constituency, I do in mine, is really important. It's not enough just for the SENCO. It's about getting the leadership in place, training in place, and the right protocols in place to ensure that the whole system is better able to meet the needs of children, and that then will actually reduce some of the other impacts, including cost impacts on the system. In recent weeks, I had the privilege of visiting Inman's Primary School in Heddon, where staff spoke candidly about the mounting pressure created by soaring demand for SEND provision, pressures that far exceed the funding currently available. At St Mary's School in Beverley, head teacher Laura Wallace expressed her deep concern at the growing gap between pupils' needs and the resources that she has at her disposal, making it ever more difficult to provide the tailored support every child deserves. Happily give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank you to the honourable member for giving way. I've also met with about 18 schools, either here in Westminster or at home in the constituency, and more recently with the Young People's Voices of SEND in Doncaster. And every single time their first question is about the support, the capacity, but also that transition from being a young adult into work as well. But would you agree with me that in order to make sure that we get the funding, that we also need to listen to those voices at the grassroots of the people that experience it, to make sure that we understand the ideas that they've got and the solutions, and that we push and direct that funding into the right places?
I agree with the honourable gentleman. He makes a powerful point, and my appeal to colleagues in the chamber, particularly perhaps newer members, is to focus on and take an interest in the distribution as well as the top. It's quite hard to get your head around the many issues that are involved in the kind of overall national issues of quantum, service delivery, training and the rest of it. And so distribution can easily get left behind, and yet it is a vital and important thing. And I can't say it brings a great deal of joy or satisfaction to you as a Member of Parliament pursuing it, because so many people look at you blankly back. But in fact, distribution is important, and I hope colleagues will want to take it on as an issue. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Very quickly, some children thrive academically, some thrive practically. It's all about finding the right place for them, whether it's a doctor, whether it's a mechanic, whether it's a plasterer, whether it's a farmer. So does the SENS needs really must not, when it comes to checking on a child's ability, but ensuring that they find their place. It's not a standard box for all, it's a different box for each one.
Well, I absolutely agree with the honourable gentleman, who, as usual, hits the nail on the head. I know many in this House will recognise the story of the schools I've just given, because it's playing out in constituencies across the country. Parents becoming de facto care coordinators, schools dipping into ever-shrinking budgets to fund specialist provision, and local authorities caught between legal responsibilities and budgetary reality. I give way to the honourable lady.
In my constituency of Birmingham Erdington, I had a parent that contacted me who was forced to navigate a complex and lengthy tribunal process simply to challenge the decision to place her autistic son in a mainstream school, only to have the hearing then cancelled at the last moment and a place at a special school then offered. Does the right honourable member agree with me that education, health and care plans are not a silver bullet, and that we shouldn't need complex legal processes to ensure young people get the access to good early support, and that it meets the needs, and also financially that young people, the money follows the child or the young person? Thank you.
Lady is absolutely right. I was chairing the Education Committee when the previous government, or the coalition government, did reforms and brought in EHCPs as a replacement for statements. But I remember then thinking, and lots of good improvements were made, very sincere ministers really working hard at it, and brought in a better system. But the fundamentals remain, and one of the aims was to get away from this adversarial, legalistic basis where articulate and typically better off people were able to use sharp elbows to get their child what they needed, and pity the inarticulate single mother unable to engage with the system. What was she going to get? And that promise was to make it better. But the fundamentals remain. If the supply is here and the demand is out here, well, you are going to get that. And even the local authorities with the best will in the world are going to end up being defensive. They're going to say no as a matter of course, and they're only going to give way when they're forced to. So, am I going on too long, Madam Deputy Speaker? So, for years I fought for a fairer distribution of SEND funding, and for years, I have to say, I've gotten nowhere. As successive governments, Labour, Conservative, and I hope not Labour again, have lacked the courage to rebalance the system. I don't pretend to have all the answers to this problem, but I know that we must work out what fairness looks like, what the minimum per pupil cost required for SEND support is, and commit to meeting that basic need, even not immediately, at least over time. If this government is not prepared to take from those above the baseline and give it to those below, perhaps the Minister, that'll be a question for her, would the government be prepared to do that? No previous government has, but maybe she will. Then we've got to find some other way. We could identify, as I say, on that mapping exercise, those who've been left behind, and say wherever there is above inflation increase in the budget, as a matter of principle, such as the spending review, 750 million, the honourable gentleman mentioned earlier, that will always be used first and foremost to lift up those below the line, while doing nothing to cause any below inflationary increase to those who are above the line. The Minister's colleague in her spending review yesterday, as has been said, did come up with that 760 million. But if the Minister does agree to that, it will still be crisis management. How do we begin to tackle systemic inequality? And above all, it's vital that we revisit the high needs national funding formula. it doesn't sufficiently account for regional cost differences, nor for the genuine cost of delivering services in dispersed or underserved areas. The formula must reflect both the complexity of need and the geography in which that need arises. It needs to account for the added costs of providing services in a rural area. And it's vital that the formula also moves away from the historic spend factor, a part of the formula that bases current funding on what a local authority spent on SEND provision in the 2018-19 financial year, and in fact how it administratively described that spend. This means that a large section of current funding is determined by pre-COVID levels of demand for SEND services despite a post-pandemic spike. The government has stated its intent to remove this factor, but progress has been painfully slow. Every year we fail to act, we condemn another group of children with complex needs to struggle without the support they deserve. And the issue isn't simply about how much money is available, it's about how accessible and responsive the system is. Families are forced into adversarial processes, schools are burdened with bureaucracy, and children are too often treated as numbers in a spreadsheet rather than individuals with potential. We need a system that's focused on early intervention, not crisis management. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not here simply to raise a problem, I'm here to call for action. Action that would ensure a fairer, more transparent funding formula that reflects real-world costs across the country, accounting for rurality and discounting historic spend, establishing a clear baseline cost of delivering effective SEND support per pupil, and ensure every local authority is brought up to that level, if not quickly, at least over time. Create better accountability mechanisms so that areas which are underperforming in delivering SEND provision can be supported and, where necessary, challenged. Above all, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would ask that the Government at the very least recognises the injustice of the current system and the injustice of the inequality that it produces. These aren't radical asks, they're practical, deliverable reforms that would make a meaningful difference for my constituents in Beverley and Holderness, and I believe and hope across the rest of the country. We have a duty as parliamentarians to ensure that every child, regardless of background, diagnosis or postcode, has the support they need to thrive. The current disparities in SEND funding undermine that duty. If we believe in a truly inclusive education system, then we cannot continue to turn a blind eye to the structural inequities built into the funding model. We owe it to our constituents, to our schools, and most importantly to the children themselves to fix this.
The question